So I want you to imagine a master architect, right?
Okay.
A completely visionary guy who designs the most breathtaking, impossible cathedral the world has ever seen. The spires are defying gravity, the stained glass captures light in this almost magical way, and the ceilings just stretch up into the firmament.
Sounds pretty incredible.
Right. But halfway through the actual construction of this thing, something shifts. He looks up at the gargoyles that he himself just carved out of the stone, and he is just utterly terrified of them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the sheer scale of his own creation completely paralyzes him. So what does he do? He drops his tools, he runs away. I mean, literally runs away to join the military under a ridiculous fake name to escape his debts.
As one does.
Exactly. And he just leaves the master blueprints scattering in the wind. So the cathedral is never actually finished.
Right.
But the half-built ruins are so spectacular and so haunting that people study those broken stones for centuries, just trying to figure out what the finished building would have looked like.
It's a really striking image. And honestly, it captures the central, tragic, but also awe-inspiring paradox of the man we are looking at today. Because, we have this ingrained expectation that historical geniuses are supposed to be, well, monumental.
Yeah, we expect them to finish the cathedral.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cut the ribbon, hand over the completed masterpiece. But with the figure we're deep diving into today, the fragmentation isn't an accident. The fragmentation is the entire point.
Which is exactly why you and I are taking this journey today. Because if you were listening to this, you're the kind of curious learner who just isn't satisfied with a surface-level Wikipedia skim.
Right.
You're looking for a comprehensive, well-organized study guide on one of literature's most brilliant but honestly most deeply perplexing figures, and that is Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Yeah, he has a lot to unpack.
He really is. So our mission today is this. We've gathered an entire library of sources. Biographies, dense critical essays, philosophical texts, and his own, frankly, chaotic notebooks.
Very chaotic.
And we are going to distill all of that into a definitive guide covering his life, his major works, his core themes, and his absolutely wild ride through critical reception.
Because we are exploring a man who was simultaneously a once-in-a-generation genius and an absolute walking disaster.
Truly.
A poet who genuinely feared his own mind and whose greatest works are celebrated specifically because they're unfinished.
Yeah. And to really get Coleridge, you have to understand...
And you have to recognize that he represents the quintessential bipolar vision of Romanticism. I mean, we aren't just here to recount a list of poems he wrote. We need to explore the mechanics of why those poems matter to us right now.
Exactly.
We'll be unpacking how his profound personal alienation, his devastating political disillusionment, and his lifelong agonizing obsession with the divine didn't just shape his own messy life, but literally wove the DNA of modern literature and, literary criticism too.
So let's start with the boy, because the sources make it super clear that to understand the mind that dreamt up a nightmare like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, you have to look at the environment that forged it.
You really do.
So he was born in 1772 in Devonshire, and his father, the Reverend John Coleridge, was the headmaster of a local school and a pretty distinguished scholar in his own right.
Right, but the sources describe the father as deeply eccentric.
Oh, massively. Brilliant, yes, but totally absent-minded, like the kind of guy who would walk out of the house completely oblivious to his own dress, his shirt unbuttoned, his mind entirely lost in Hebrew theology.
Yeah, just living in his own head.
Exactly. And Samuel, who was the youngest of 13 children.
13.
I know, right?
Okay.
He was heavily, obviously favored by this eccentric father.
And that favoritism, while it definitely nurtured his intellect, it came with a really heavy psychological cost. Young Samuel identified intensely with his father's eccentric brilliance. He saw himself in that absent-minded, scholarly persona.
Yeah, but then you have the other side of the parental dynamic.
Right. His mother, Anne, was reported to be quite cold, practical, and detached. And more acutely, his status as the golden child made him a massive target in a house of 13 kids.
Naturally.
Yeah, he was relentlessly bullied by his older brother, Francis, and even tormented by the family nurse, Molly.
I'm just trying to picture the daily reality of this. You've got this highly sensitive, deeply imaginative kid realizing very early on that the physical world around him, like his siblings, his caretakers, is actively hostile.
It's a terrifying realization for a kid.
So what does he do? He retreats.
Completely.
He checks out of reality and dives headfirst into books. But he's not just reading normal children's nursery rhymes.
No, not at all.
He is devouring massive fantasy epics like the Arabian Nights and Robinson Crusoe. And there's a detail in the sources that literally stopped me in my tracks. He was reading adult philosophy at the age of 6.
Which is terrifying when you consider the cognitive development of a 6-year-old.
Right.
I mean, you have a child whose brain is still figuring out basic social dynamics, but he is filling that brain with dense metaphysical concepts and terrifying genies from ancient folklore.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It is. And he later wrote a self-assessment looking back at this exact period, and it's just brutally honest. He wrote, quote, "Sensibility, imagination, vanity, sloth, I was a character." He recognized early on that he was fundamentally disconnected from normal childhood.
It sounds like the ultimate foundational case of gifted kid burnout.
Oh, absolutely.
He has zero executive function, zero discipline, just raw, unfiltered processing power and deep emotional vulnerability. But then tragedy strikes. His father, who is basically his one anchor in the world, the one person who gets his weirdness, dies when Samuel is young.
And that completely shatters his world.
Right. And as a result, he is uprooted from the rural, natural beauty of Devonshire and sent away to Christ's Hospital School in London.
This is a monumental culture shock, and it sets up a trauma that will echo through his poetry for the rest of his entire life. He goes from wandering open fields to being trapped in the middle of a loud, dirty, heavily industrialized city.
Which he hated.
Hated it. As he later described it in his poetry, he was pent mid cloisters dim. He felt caged.
Right, and at this school, he encounters a figure who seems to perfectly diagnose his entire personality. The strict schoolmaster, Reverend Bowyer. Bowyer famously called young Coleridge, "that sensible fool."
It's an incredibly perceptive oxymoron, actually.
Yeah, explain that, because sensible meant something different back then, right?
Exactly. Sensible in the 18th century meaning of the word meant possessing high sensibility. He was hyper-aware, emotionally and intellectually perceptive.
But still a fool.
Right. Yet a fool because he completely lacked the practical, grounded skills required to actually navigate the real world. He was a brilliant mind, completely untethered from reality.
So if we take that sensible fool and advance the timeline a bit, things get even more chaotic. And this is the part I really need to unpack. How does a kid who reads philosophy at age 6 end up on a horse in the military? I need to understand the mechanics of this downward spiral.
Okay, so to understand the mechanism of that spiral, we really have to look at the atmospheric pressure of the world when he went to Cambridge University in 1791.
Which was an intense time.
Very. This is the absolute height of the fervor surrounding the French Revolution. Cambridge wasn't just a quiet place of study, it was a hotbed of radical, dangerous reform activity. The air was just electric with the idea that the old, corrupt European monarchies were falling and a new utopian age of human rights was dawning.
And Coleridge, being hyper-receptive to big ideas, gets completely swept up in it.
Utterly consumed.
Yeah.
He starts supporting highly controversial figures like William Friend, a Unitarian who was actually tried and expelled from the university for his dissenting religious and political views.
Oh.
Yeah, Coleridge is literally up in the gallery during the trial, cheering Friend on, making a massive public spectacle of his radicalism. But here is the critical tension. While his political ideals are soaring toward this utopian perfection, his personal day-to-day life completely unravels.
And unravels almost feels too polite.
It really does.
The sources detail a descent into this brutal cycle of heavy drinking, visiting prostitutes, and crucially, this is where he begins taking opium. Initially for physical ailments, but it quickly becomes a psychological crutch.
Right.
And because of this chaotic lifestyle, he racks up massive, crushing debts.
And we have to pause here and consider what debt meant for a student in the 1790s. It wasn't just a bad credit score or getting annoying letters. It was the very real threat of debtor's prison. It was absolute social ruin.
Right, so he is in a sheer panic. And his solution to this very practical problem is baffling. In 1793, he runs away from Cambridge, and in an act of pure desperation, he enlists in the 15th Light Dragoons.
He joins the cavalry.
It's like a Silicon Valley software engineer trying to escape a bad mortgage by joining the French Foreign Legion. It makes no sense.
Not at all.
And the fake name he chooses, Silas Tunken Cumberbake.
It is almost comically transparent. He literally keeps his own initials, STC. Presumably so he wouldn't forget his own alias, or, so he could keep his monogrammed belongings.
Oh my God, I didn't even think of the monogram shirts. But the physical reality of this has to be hilarious, right?
Yeah.
And tragic. He's a Cambridge intellectual who can barely keep his own thoughts organized, now expected to groom a massive warhorse, polish brass, and ride in formation.
He was, by all accounts, a disaster of a soldier. He was constantly falling off his horse, his saddle was always slipping, he was just physically incapable of cavalry drills.
I'm just picturing him trying to hold a sword.
It's a mess. Instead, his military service mostly consisted of sitting in the barracks, utilizing his one actual skill.
Oh, he was.
Writing eloquent, flowery love letters for his fellow illiterate soldiers to send to their sweethearts.
You're kidding.
Nope. And he did this in exchange for them grooming his horse for him. He also spent some time nursing a comrade who had fallen ill with smallpox, so he wasn't useless, just useless at soldiering.
Okay, so he's basically the barracks scribe. But eventually, this charade falls apart. His brothers track him down, and they have to intervene to buy him out of his enlistment. But the military didn't just let people walk away back then.
No, desertion or sudden discharge was highly regulated. The only way his brothers could convince his commanding officer to let him go without a severe penalty was by having Coleridge accept a formal discharge on the grounds of insanity.
Which honestly might have felt pretty accurate to the commanding officer who watched this guy try to ride a horse.
Probably.
But it really highlights that chaotic, uncontrollable energy driving him. He's allowed to return to Cambridge, but he never finishes. He leaves without a degree. And right around this time, he bumps into another young poet and radical named Robert Southey. And together, they hatch a plan that sounds exactly like a 1790s hipster commune. The sources call it pantisocracy. What is the actual mechanism of this plan?
Yeah.
Because it sounds wild.
It is wild. So the word pantisocracy literally translates to equal rule by all. The mechanics of the plan were deeply naive, but incredibly romantic. They believed that Europe was fundamentally corrupt. The soil itself was tainted by centuries of tyranny, monarchy, and bloodshed.
Okay.
So they decided they needed to physically remove themselves and establish a utopian egalitarian commune in America. Specifically, they picked the banks of the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania.
Wait, why the Susquehanna? Do they know anything about Pennsylvania at all?
Mostly, they picked it because the name Susquehanna sounded poetic and musical to them.
You cannot be serious.
I am. They imagined they would farm the land for a few hours in the morning and then spend the rest of the day philosophizing, writing poetry, and living in perfect intellectual harmony without any private property.
It's the ultimate let's buy a farm and escape society fantasy, just based on vibes.
Pure vibes.
But there was a catch, right? To make this commune work, to propagate this new society, they needed to emigrate as families. They needed wives.
Yes. And this logistical requirement for their utopia led to one of the greatest personal disasters of Coleridge's life.
Oh, boy.
Southey was engaged to a woman named Edith Fricker. To keep the communal group tight-knit, Southey heavily pressured Coleridge into marrying Edith's sister, Sarah Fricker.
Wait, he marries a woman just to fulfill the entry requirements for a utopian commune that doesn't even exist yet?
That is essentially exactly what happened. The utopian commune, of course, never materialized. They couldn't raise the funds, and they ended up arguing over the exact rules of the society.
Naturally.
But while pantisocracy dissolved into thin air, Coleridge found himself permanently legally bound in a marriage to a woman he was fundamentally incompatible with.
That is so tragic.
It is. Sarah was practical, grounded, and likely deeply frustrated by her husband's absolute inability to earn a living or stay focused. While Coleridge was just lost in the clouds, this disastrous mismatch drove a deep, gnawing sense of domestic alienation that haunted him for the rest of his life.
It's just a staggering chain of bad decisions. But, shockingly, out of all this chaos like the debt, the dragoons, the failed commune, the unhappy marriage, we arrive at what the sources universally refer to as the Annus Mirabilis, the miracle years.
Yes, roughly 1797 to 1798.
Right. He moves to a cottage in Nether Stowey in the Quantock Hills, specifically to be near the poet William Wordsworth and Wordsworth's sister, Dorothy. And the intellectual chemistry that happens here is just explosive.
It is arguably one of the most important literary friendships in history. Together, Coleridge and Wordsworth conceive and publish a volume of poetry called Lyrical Ballads. And in doing so, they essentially birth the English Romantic movement.
Which is huge.
It changed everything. They completely upend the rigid, highly formalized poetry of the 18th century, focusing instead on ordinary language, raw emotion, and the deep psychological power of nature.
And Coleridge's personal output during this brief window is unbelievable. I mean, he writes The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Frost at Midnight, the first part of Christabel, and Kubla Khan. It's a hot streak that basically defines his entire career.
But the tragedy of Coleridge is that he could never sustain it. The fall from that creative peak was incredibly rapid and brutal.
What happened?
Well, the physical climate in the Lake District, where they later moved, was damp and freezing. This really exacerbated his numerous physical ailments, rheumatism, digestive issues. And to manage the intense chronic pain, his reliance on opium escalated from occasional medicinal use to a severe, crippling addiction.
And psychologically, he's deteriorating just as fast, right? The sources mention he falls hopelessly, obsessively in love with a woman named Sarah Hutchinson.
Yes. Who, to make matters infinitely more complicated, was the sister of Wordsworth's future wife.
Oh, that is messy.
Unbelievably messy. So Coleridge is trapped in a miserable marriage to his own Sarah, completely in love with this other Sarah, and spending all his time embedded in the Wordsworth family dynamic. It became incredibly toxic.
I can imagine.
His addiction made him erratic, paranoid, and intensely needy. This slowly eroded his relationship with his wife, but more devastatingly, the intense, almost codependent intellectual brotherhood he had with Wordsworth began to fracture.
So, feeling his life collapsing, he tries his old trick. He tries to physically run away from his problems.
The Dragoon reflex.
Exactly. In 1804, he books passage on a ship to Malta in the Mediterranean. He's hoping the warm climate will cure his bodily pain and that the isolation will help him kick the opium habit. But the sources are pretty bleak on this point. They note he returns to England in 1806 as a, quote, broken man.
He comes back worse than when he left. He is hopelessly addicted to massive quantities of laudanum, which is a tincture of opium and alcohol. He is plagued by terrifying visceral night terrors, which he extensively chronicles in his notebooks.
Ugh, poor guy.
He is completely, permanently estranged from his wife. He has lost his creative confidence. He is just a wanderer.
It's a crushing narrative. You read about this brilliant 6-year-old, and now he's a destitute addict in his 30s. But there's a final vital chapter to his biography. In 1816, Coleridge basically hits rock bottom and realizes he simply cannot survive on his own.
He needs structure.
Right, an institutional structure. So he moves into the home of a physician named Dr. James Gilman in the Highgate area of London with the explicit goal of having Gilman medically manage his addiction.
And under Gilman's patient, strict care, Coleridge's opium intake is regulated. He never fully kicks the habit, but he finds a measure of stability that he hasn't had in decades. And what emerges from this stability is a profound intellectual transformation.
Because the radical kid cheering for the French Revolution is just gone.
Entirely gone. The fiery young Unitarian utopian transforms into a staunchly conservative, Orthodox Anglican philosopher. He holds court in Highgate.
The sage of Highgate.
Exactly. He couldn't muster the executive function to finish his massive, systematic philosophical treatises, the great cathedral he always promised to build, but his brilliant, sprawling, mesmerizing conversations drew younger generations of admirers to him. He became an institution. His fragmented prose works cemented his legacy not just as a poet, but as one of the towering cultural intellects of the 19th century.
Okay, that journey perfectly sets the stage for us to transition into the work itself. Because you really can't read his poetry without seeing the ghost of that struggling, terrified genius.
Definitely not.
So let's look at the major works and literary themes. And we have to start with the absolute mammoth in the room, his magnum opus, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. For anyone who hasn't read it since high school, the basic narrative is this. An old, ragged sailor stops a guest who is on his way into a wedding feast. The sailor uses this hypnotic glittering eye to paralyze the guest and forces him to listen to a terrifying story.
A very terrifying story.
Right. Out at sea, the sailor shoots a sacred bird, an albatross, with his crossbow for absolutely no logical reason. And this act brings down a horrifying curse on the ship. The crew dies of thirst, and the mariner is cursed with a state of life and death, forced to wander the earth forever, telling his agonizing tale to whoever he feels compelled to stop.
On a narrative level, it's a gripping ghost story. But the interpretative landscape, trying to figure out what the poem actually means, is vast, and it is fiercely debated in the critical sources we've reviewed. One of the major fault lines in the criticism is exactly what kind of moral universe this poem operates within. Is there a just God overseeing this ocean, or is it pure chaos?
Right. And the sources highlight a huge clash here between two major critics. You have Robert Penn Warren on one side and Harold Bloom on the other.
Yes. So Robert Penn Warren argues that the poem is essentially a Christian parable. He reads the shooting of the albatross as a direct reenactment of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. It is original sin.
Okay, that tracks.
The mariner commits a senseless crime against nature and the laws of hospitality. This triggers a divine punishment, which leads to a period of agonizing repentance, and finally, a moment of partial redemption when the mariner subconsciously blesses the hideous water snakes swimming around the rotting ship. For Warren, it's a story of sin and reconciliation under a Christian God.
But then you read Harold Bloom, and Bloom completely rejects that neat, comforting Christian reading. Bloom looks at the text and argues that this isn't a Christian cosmos at all. It's a Gnostic one.
Exactly. And we should clarify what a Gnostic cosmos implies here. Gnosticism, in a literary sense, suggests a universe where the true benevolent divinity is entirely hidden, estranged, or perhaps absent, and the physical world is ruled by lower, often malicious, irrational powers.
And Bloom's argument makes so much sense when you look at the mechanics of the punishment. I mean, if this is a Christian story of a lesson learned, why is the punishment so utterly disproportionate to the crime?
It's massive overkill.
He showed a bird, and in response, 200 men dropped dead, their souls flying past him like the whiz of his crossbow. He is tortured by spirits. It feels entirely gratuitous. It doesn't feel like a fatherly God teaching a lesson. It feels like a nightmare universe reacting violently to a random stimulus.
What's fascinating is how Coleridge's imagery deeply supports Bloom's idea of a nightmarish, irrational universe. Think about the sensory deprivation he describes. You have those famous claustrophobic lines, day after day, we stook nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. The ocean itself begins to rot, the water burns with witches' oils. Slimy things crawl with legs upon the slimy sea.
Now, the imagery is so visceral. And then the ultimate terror, which completely shatters the idea of a rational moral universe, the ghost ship. A skeleton ship approaches without any wind, and on its deck there are two figures. One is Death, a literal skeleton. Yep. The other is a terrifying woman, described as having red lips, yellow hair, and skin as white as leprosy. She is the nightmare, life in death. And what are they doing? They are literally rolling dice for the mariner's soul. They are gambling.
Yeah.
And life and death wins the mariner.
That is the crux of the Gnostic terror. Your eternal fate isn't decided by a divine tribunal weighing your moral worth. It's decided by a roll of the dice by a leprous demon on a rotting sea. That is not a universe governed by a benevolent, rational God. It's a universe of sheer psychological and cosmic terror.
But wait, let me push back on this a bit because I want to look at the frame of the story. If this is just a nihilistic nightmare, why does the mariner specifically stop a wedding guest? He could have stopped a merchant, a priest, anyone. Out of three people walking to a joyful celebration, he grabs one, pulls him away from the music in the community, and makes him miss the entire ceremony. What is the mechanism behind choosing a wedding?
That is a crucial question, and it unlocks one of the deepest themes across all of Coleridge's work: the unbearable tension between isolation and communion. Think about what a wedding represents. It is the ultimate symbol of domesticity, social harmony, continuity, and religious sacrament. It is a community coming together to create life and meaning.
It's the exact opposite of a guy stuck alone on a rotting ship surrounded by corpses.
Exactly. The mariner represents absolute, cursed alienation. He is the ultimate outsider. By having the mariner interrupt the wedding feast, the poem suggests something deeply unsettling, that the true creation of meaning, the genuine confrontation with guilt, mortality, and the terrifying scale of the cosmos is an isolating, agonizing individual struggle. You cannot find ultimate truth in the comfortable, socially approved rituals of a wedding.
There's a critic in our sources, Morse Peckham, who has this brilliant phrase for it. He calls the mariner's interruption of the wedding a romantic cultural vandalism.
It's a perfect description. The mariner violently pulls the guest away from the warm illusion of social solidarity and forces him to stare into the abyss of individual isolation.
And it works. The guest wakes up the next morning a sadder and a wiser man. It's as if the mariner is a carrier of a psychological virus, infecting the comfortable guest with the trauma of a heightened imagination.
That's a great way to put it.
Which brings us beautifully to the next major work on our outline, Frost at Midnight. This is part of a group of works critics call his conversation poems. If The Mariner is a loud, chaotic, supernatural blockbuster, Frost at Midnight is an intimate, quiet, seemingly realistic indie film.
Very quiet.
The setup is simple. Coleridge is sitting alone in his cottage at midnight. His baby son, Hartley, is sleeping peacefully in a cradle next to him. Everyone else is asleep. The fire in the grate is dying down. It's so quiet that the silence itself becomes oppressive.
The psychological depth operating beneath the surface of Frost at Midnight is truly remarkable. The poem begins as a meditation on the immediate environment, but quickly spirals into a profound exploration of human consciousness. Coleridge stares at the dying fire, and he notices a thin, delicate film of ash fluttering in the draft of the grate.
And the sources note that in the rural folklore of the 1790s, this fluttering piece of ash had a specific name, right?
Yes, it was superstitiously called a stranger. The belief was that seeing this fluttering ash portended the arrival of an absent friend or an unexpected guest. But Coleridge takes this folk superstition and internalizes it. In the deep, suffocating silence of the night, this restless, unquiet piece of ash becomes a literal mirror for his own hyperactive mind.
Because he can't stop thinking.
Right. As the critic Mary Jacobus notes in our sources, this is a poem fundamentally about the interior life of the imagination. Coleridge writes that the ash is the sole unquiet thing. His adult mind is self-watching and subtilizing. He is projecting his own deep-seated anxiety and restless energy onto a completely lifeless, meaningless object.
Because he can't turn his brain off. And that reflection on the grate triggers a memory. He mentally time travels back to his own traumatic childhood at Christ's Hospital School. He remembers sitting in the massive, drafty schoolroom, staring at the grate, desperately, agonizingly hoping that a literal stranger, maybe a townsman from Devonshire, or his aunt, would come burst through the doors and rescue him from the strict, gloomy cloisters of the city.
It's a poignant realization of his own trauma. And looking at his sleeping infant son, Hartley, Coleridge makes a solemn vow. He resolves that Hartley will not suffer that same crushing urban alienation.
Right.
He promises that Hartley will grow up in nature, that he will wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores. He believes that nature is the eternal language of God, and that by growing up in the wild, his son will be spiritually educated by the divine directly.
But there is a massive twist to this touching fatherly moment that the sources reveal. The scholar James K. Chandler points out that this intimate confession of childhood trauma was essentially hijacked later by Coleridge's best friend, William Wordsworth. How does that work?
It's a brilliant, if ruthless, piece of literary maneuvering by Wordsworth. Wordsworth read Frost at Midnight and saw Coleridge's deep anxiety about being a city boy trapped in the cloisters. Years later, when Wordsworth was writing his own massive autobiographical epic poem, The Prelude, he took Coleridge's confession and weaponized it to build his own personal brand.
Wow.
Yeah, Wordsworth framed Coleridge as the damaged, nervous, fragmented urbanite whose mind was broken by the city and who desperately needed to be cured by the healing power of nature. A power that Wordsworth, the ultimate nature poet, had mastered.
So Wordsworth basically uses Coleridge's trauma as a foil to make himself look like this serene, enlightened guru. Look at my poor, broken city boyfriend. He really needs to walk in the woods with me.
Pretty much.
That is a fascinating, slightly passive-aggressive dynamic in their friendship. But let's pivot from the quiet, anxious domesticity of the cottage to the absolute, unbridled supernatural wildness of Christabel and Kubla Khan. The demonic works.
Oh, these are wild.
Kubla Khan is arguably one of the most famous fragments in the English language. It's this hallucinatory vision of an Eastern emperor building a majestic pleasure dome, with caverns measureless to man and sunless seas. But at the very end, it shifts to this terrifying vision of a youth with flashing eyes and floating hair who has fed on honeydew and drunk the milk of paradise.
The interpretation of Kubla Khan provided by Harold Bloom is an essential lens here. Bloom suggests that beneath the exotic imagery, the hidden, driving theme of the poem is holy dread.
Dread of what, though? He's describing a beautiful pleasure dome.
Dread of himself. Dread of his own demonic, unchecked imaginative powers. Bloom argues that the terrifying youth at the end of the poem, the one people have to weave a circle around 3 times to protect themselves from, is the ultimate poet. It is the version of himself that Coleridge simultaneously desperately longed to be and utterly feared becoming.
That's incredible.
Right. Coleridge was terrified that if he fully unleashed his imaginative power, if he fully drank the milk of paradise, it would destroy his sanity. It would isolate him entirely from human society.
He's the architect terrified of his own gargoyles.
Exactly.
And we see a different kind of terror in Christabel. This is a Gothic tale where a pure, innocent girl, Christabel, goes out into the dark woods at night to pray, and she discovers a beautiful, distressed woman named Geraldine. Christabel brings Geraldine back into her father's heavily fortified castle to protect her.
Which is a mistake.
A huge mistake, because the audience quickly realizes Geraldine is not a helpless victim. She is something demonic, perhaps a vampire or an evil spirit, and she begins to subtly, sexually, and psychologically dominate the household.
The critical views on Christabel, particularly from feminist scholars like Sarah Webster Goodwin, highlight the profoundly subversive nature of the poem. Geraldine is the embodiment of the castrating female, or the monstrous uncanny. What's crucial is where the horror takes place. It doesn't stay in the spooky woods. Geraldine is invited inside. She invades and corrupts the domestic sphere, the bedroom, the relationship between father and daughter.
Just like the mariners invading the wedding.
Precisely. The home, the family unit, the castle, these supposed bastions of safety and social order are shown to be incredibly fragile, easily marginalized and destroyed by dark, irrational, psychological forces from the outside.
But here's what I struggle with. We are talking about vampires, demons, and pleasure domes. But historically, right outside Coleridge's window, the real world was exploding. The French Revolution was turning into a bloodbath. England was in turmoil. Why is he writing about spooky castles and sunless seas? It feels like pure escapism.
It is escapism, but as the critic Carl Woodring asks in our sources, we must look at what he was escaping from. Woodring argues that politics formed a massive part of the trauma Coleridge was fleeing. As a young man, he poured his entire soul into the utopian promise of the French Revolution. When that revolution devolved into the guillotine, the reign of terror, and the invasion of free nations, it broke his heart and shattered his worldview.
So it's a retreat.
Exactly. The Gothic nightmares of Christabel and the opulent, walled-off pleasure domes of Kubla Khan were psychological retreats. He was building imaginative fortresses to hide from a public political sphere that had completely betrayed him.
That makes perfect sense. He retreats into the text. Which brings us inevitably to part 3, the philosophy of poetic form and textual instability. Because this section of the sources completely blew my mind.
Oh, this is the best part.
When we talk about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, we talk about it as if it's a fixed object, a book you can go buy in a bookstore. But the sources reveal a shocking reality. There is no single, definitive Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Over his lifetime, Coleridge published 18 distinct versions of it. He published 16 different versions of the Aeolian harp.
It is a nightmare for literary editors, but an absolute goldmine for psychological analysis.
It's like a modern software developer who releases a video game but then spends 20 years obsessively pushing patches, updates, and bug fixes to the code. The problem is, which version of the game is the real one?
That is the exact methodological problem scholars face today. It is a persistent myth that there is a definitive text of a Coleridge poem. Relying solely on the final editions published late in his life, like the 1828 or 1834 collections, is a dangerous analytical trap.
Why? Wouldn't the final version be exactly what he wanted to say?
Because the final version is often a much older, much more conservative man trying to rewrite the history of his own radical youth.
Wow.
Take the poem, The Aeolian Harp. When he first drafted it in 1795, it was a rather frivolous, lighthearted, slightly erotic love effusion for his then-fiancée, Sarah Fricker. But as decades passed, Coleridge's philosophical views deepened and darkened. He went back to that simple love poem and retroactively patched it, inserting heavy, mature, complex philosophical concepts about the one life within us and abroad, which is a pantheistic view of the universe.
So if a high school student reads the final 1828 version of the Aeolian harp, they might assume 23-year-old Coleridge was a fully formed genius philosopher, when in reality, 50-year-old Coleridge basically went back in time and put those words in his younger self's mouth.
Exactly. He was constantly trying to harmonize his chaotic past with his conservative present.
And he did the exact same thing to the Ancient Mariner.
Right.
The biggest, most famous patch he pushed to the Mariner was in 1817, nearly 20 years after he first wrote it. He went back and added this extensive prose gloss-like little paragraphs of explanation written in the margins alongside the poetry.
Yes, and the hermeneutic subtext, meaning the underlying theory of how we are supposed to interpret the text behind that 1817 gloss, is crucial to understanding Coleridge's later mind.
Tell me more.
Well, the critic John T. Netlin argues that the voice of the marginal gloss is entirely different from the voice of the poem itself. The poem is a chaotic, irrational, pre-modern ballad, but the gloss reads like a scholarly, rational, highly educated 18th century antiquarian editor who is desperately trying to force a neat, moral cause and effect structure onto a nightmare.
Give me an example of how the gloss tries to tame the poem.
Think about the moment the mariner shoots the bird. The poem just says he did it. There's no reason given. The action is terrifyingly random. But the gloss writer steps in and writes in the margin, "The ancient mariner inhospitably killeth the pious bird of good omen."
Oh, wow.
The gloss introduces words like inhospitably and pious. It tries to define the crime in legal and religious terms. The gloss writer wants everything to make logical sense. The mariner commits a quantifiable crime, therefore the spirits have a legal right to punish him, therefore he learns a moral lesson.
But the poem actively resist the gloss. As we discussed, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. The dice game with death makes no logical sense. The gloss is like a desperate parent trying to explain to a child that the monster under the bed is just a shadow while the monster is actively eating the bed.
That is a brilliant way to put it. The intense tension between the wild, irrational text and the desperate, rational gloss represents the civil war inside Coleridge's own mind. It is the tension between his later conservative Anglican rationalism and his raw, youthful experience of the religious sublime, the terrifying, incomprehensible power of the universe. He was trying, and failing, to domesticate his own nightmare.
So underneath all this endless rewriting and patching, what did Coleridge actually believe poetry was supposed to do? What was the philosophical goal of his art?
To grasp his ultimate philosophical ambition, we really have to look at his highly specific view of nature and symbolism. For Coleridge, nature was not merely a pretty backdrop for human drama. He believed that the physical world, trees, clouds, oceans, was the literal, legible language of God. Furthermore, he saw the human poetic imagination not just as a tool for making up stories, but as a finite echo of the infinite divine logos, the word of God that originally spoke the universe into creation in Genesis.
Wait, so when a poet uses their imagination to write a truly unified poem, they aren't just entertaining people, they are actually mirroring the divine act of creation on a smaller scale.
Precisely. And this brings us to one of his most complex but vital concepts. The sources note his heavy reliance on a specific term, tautogory.
Yes, I saw that in the reading and it completely threw me. What on earth is tautogory? We need to break this down simply.
Let's use an analogy. Think of a standard traffic stop sign. The red octagon is an allegory. The metal and paint don't inherently contain the concept of stopping. We just socially agree that the sign points to the idea of stop. The sign is a stand-in.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now imagine a massive, terrifying thunderstorm. The thunderstorm doesn't just represent or point to the power of nature. It doesn't stand in for the power of nature. It is the power of nature while simultaneously being itself a storm. That is tautogory.
Okay, I see. So allegory is just a label pointing to a box, but tautogory is the actual contents of the box manifesting themselves.
Exactly. For Coleridge, a true poetic symbol had to be tautogorical. It couldn't just arbitrarily point to a divine truth. It had to actually partake in that divine truth. It had to be a living, breathing part of the cosmic whole. The goal of his poetry was to achieve this tautogorical unity, to write a poem that functioned like a thunderstorm, a direct manifestation of the divine reality.
That is an impossibly high bar to set for yourself.
And that impossible standard is the source of his deep tragedy, because his modern, highly educated, skeptical mind constantly doubted whether he was actually succeeding. He tortured himself wondering if he was truly reading God's handwriting in nature, or if he was just staring at a dying fire and projecting his own neuroses onto the fluttering ash.
And that agonizing internal anxiety brings us right into part 4. Critical reception and the shaping of a legacy. Because while Coleridge was privately agonizing over whether his poetry echoed the word of God, the literary critics of his day were publicly brutally hammering him in the press.
The contemporary reviews were utterly vicious. And to understand the mechanics of this hatred, we have to look neutrally at the political context of the early 19th century. In his youth, Coleridge was a loud, highly visible radical. He was essentially a celebrity spokesperson for the utopian ideals of the French Revolution.
But then, as we noted, the revolution goes dark. The Reign of Terror happens, France violently invades Switzerland, a free republic, an event Coleridge writes a devastating poem about called France, an ode. His worldview shatters, and he slowly, steadily aligns himself with conservative, establishment, Tory views of the British government.
Which strategically positioned him to be hated by absolutely everyone.
Right. The mechanics of his shift made him a universal target. The radical, liberal press, like his former friends, attacked him relentlessly for being a sellout, a coward, a political apostate who traded his revolutionary ideals for a comfortable pension. On the flip side, the conservative establishment press never fully trusted him because they always remembered him as the dangerous kid cheering for the overthrow of the monarchy.
And the attacks were deeply personal. You have brilliant vitriolic critics like William Hazlitt writing these brutal takedowns of Coleridge. Hazlitt famously painted him as a wasted genius, a man who possessed all the talent in the world but squandered it on opium and laziness. Hazlitt called him a mad metaphysician who produced nothing of value and just lived entirely on the sound of his own mesmerizing voice.
So he dies in 1834 with this cloud over his head. The public perception is that he's a lazy, opium-addicted, politically inconsistent dreamer who left behind a pile of confusing fragments. So, How do we get from that disaster to the canonical giant we are studying today? How does he end up in the Norton Anthology?
The resurrection of Samuel Taylor Coleridge is largely due to an incredibly successful, coordinated Victorian rehabilitation campaign. It was waged primarily by his family, specifically his brilliant daughter, Sarah Coleridge, and his nephew, Henry Nelson Coleridge, who stepped in to become his literary executors.
They basically hired a posthumous PR firm to clean up his image.
Effectively, yes. They took control of his massive archive of unpublished notebooks, letters, and fragments. And as they edited his posthumous works for the Victorian public, they carefully curated the narrative. They downplayed, sanitized, or entirely scrubbed away the embarrassing details of his youthful radicalism, his failed commune, and the grim realities of his severe opium addiction.
They smoothed out all the gargoyles. And what image did they present instead?
They framed him perfectly for the anxieties of the Victorian audience. They presented him as a wise, elderly Tory sage and a profound, idealist Christian philosopher. And the sanitized version of Coleridge hit the market at exactly the right time.
Why? What was happening in the Victorian era that made them so hungry for this specific version of Coleridge?
The Victorian era was plunging into a massive crisis of faith. The emerging scientific worldview, like geological discoveries about the age of the Earth and eventually Darwinian evolution, was deeply threatening traditional, literalist Christian faith. Intellectuals felt they had to choose between rational science and their religion.
That's a huge conflict.
It was, but Coleridge's later prose work, specifically a book called Aids to Reflection, became massively influential because it provided a third way. Coleridge's philosophy offered a framework to read scripture and understand spirituality that wasn't purely literalist, but deeply psychological and symbolic. He gave anxious Victorian Christians a sophisticated philosophical toolkit to reconcile their faith with modern critical thought.
He basically saved their intellectual lives.
Yes.
But we have to address the elephant in the room that the sources tackle head on. Even as his reputation as a great philosopher was growing, a massive scandal began to emerge regarding how he actually wrote that philosophy, the plagiarism controversy.
Yes. It became apparent that Coleridge had lifted heavy, extensive amounts of material from highly complex German philosophers, most notably Immanuel Kant and Friedrich von Schelling. He translated their ideas and presented them in his own works, often without any attribution.
And to be clear, this wasn't just accidental cryptomnesia. He was lifting whole paragraphs.
The plagiarism is a documented, factual reality. Modern critics, most notably Norman Fruman in his blistering book Coleridge, The Damaged Archangel, have detailed extensively, line by line, how much Coleridge copied.
So does that invalidate him as a thinker? I mean, is he just a fraud who stole German homework and passed it off to the English?
It's a complex ethical and literary question. The sources suggest that while the plagiarism is undeniable, focusing purely on the moral outrage misses the broader cultural mechanics of what Coleridge actually achieved. The true lasting value of Coleridge wasn't necessarily in generating entirely original, airtight philosophical systems from scratch. His genius lay in his role as a synthesizer and a transmitter.
Explain that. What did he synthesize?
He took these incredibly dense, abstract, almost impenetrable German concepts regarding the nature of the mind, the subjective perception of reality, and the organic structure of art, and he synthesized them with the English poetic tradition. He injected German idealism into the English literary consciousness. In doing so, he essentially invented modern literary criticism as we practice it today. Yeah, before Coleridge, English criticism was mostly about whether a poem followed the strict rules of meter and rhyme. Coleridge gave English critics a totally new vocabulary to talk about organic form, the subconscious psychology of the author, and the unifying power of the imagination.
It's like he was the great translator. Not just translating the German language, but translating the architecture of thought itself, building a bridge between continental philosophy and English poetry.
Exactly.
Okay, we have covered massive, massive ground today. Let's take a breath and summarize the journey we've taken through these sources. We started by looking at a brilliant, hypersensitive kid in Devonshire who retreated from a hostile world into fantasy books, reading adult philosophy at age 6.
We followed him through a chaotic, radical youth, including his hilariously tragic stint as the worst cavalry soldier in history, Silas Tompkin Cumberbatch.
We saw the miraculous, explosive peak of his friendship with Wordsworth, producing English Romanticism's greatest hits, which was immediately followed by a tragic, opium-fueled decline that left him a broken wanderer.
And finally, we saw his resurrection in the care of a doctor, transforming into the conservative sage of Highgate, only to be further sanitized by his Victorian family.
And alongside the biography, We unpacked the core thematic engines that drive his major works. We explored the terrifying tension between isolation and communion, vividly dramatized by the mariners pulling the guest away from the social harmony of the wedding.
We analyzed the psychological mechanism of projection in Frost at midnight, where the quiet domesticity of the cottage forces his anxious mind to watch itself.
And we stared into the abyss of his holy dread, his profound fear of his own demonic imagination, as seen in the pleasure dome of Kubla Khan and the invading uncanny terror of Cristobal.
Furthermore, we examine the fascinating, frustrating textual instability of his legacy. We learn that his poems were never truly finished, but constantly revised, patched, and glossed over decades as he desperately tried to reconcile his chaotic, irrational visions with his later need for rational, conservative order.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
Oh.
Throughout his life, and for decades after his death, Coleridge was hammered by critics for his fragments. He was mocked for his inability to finish his grand philosophical treatises and criticized for constantly, obsessively rewriting his own poems instead of moving forward. He was seen as the architect who abandoned the cathedral.
But consider this entirely different perspective. What if this wasn't a failure at all? Coleridge fundamentally believed that the universe was not a static machine, but a living, breathing, organic thing. What if he realized that in a universe defined by infinite organic growth, a truly finished poem is essentially a dead thing, a butterfly pinned to a board?
Oh, that's beautiful.
Perhaps his endless revisions, his absolute inability to stop tinkering, and his brilliant, haunting, unfinished fragments are actually the purest, most accurate expression of the romantic mind. A mind that is always seeking, always becoming, always evolving, and bravely refusing to ever settle for the comforting illusion of a final, static answer.
It brings us right back to our master architect. Maybe the cathedral was never actually meant to be finished. Maybe the true beauty isn't in a completed building, but in the blueprints scattering in the wind, constantly inviting us to imagine what could have been. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Keep unpacking the world around you.